September 2012, a bullet to the head takes out this woman who ruled Miami's underworld with violence so ruthless that it terrified allies and enemies alike. This is what happens when female gangsters mess with the wrong gang.
सोचा कि इतने बुरे अत्याचार हुए मेरे साथ तो हम क्यों मर जाएं? जिन्होंने मेरे साथ अत्याचार करा हम क्यों उन्हें बता दें कि अगर किसी के साथ तुम ऐसा करोगे तो तुम्हें भी जवाब।
Let's go back to February 14th, 1981. It's a quiet village of Bemai in Uttar Pradesh, India, and they were preparing for a wedding when chaos erupted. Armed bandits stormed in, led by this woman dressed in a red sari. Her name was Pulan Devi, famously known as the Bandit Queen. Now that day, her unrelenting quest for vengeance ended in a massacre that left 22 men dead. But who was she? And what had driven her to that point? Let's go to August 10th, 1963. Born into one of India's most marginalized communities, Pulan's life was shaped by poverty and hardship. Even as a child, she stood out for her fiery temper and defiance, often clashing with her family, particularly her cousin, who became the head of the household after her grandparents passed away. So life became even harsher when at just 11 years old, she was married off to this guy 3 times her age. Now that husband was abusive, and after enduring his cruelty for such a long time, she eventually ran away. This act of rebellion, rare for women in rural India, was seen as a disgrace to her family, and so her family became determined to punish her defiance. Her cousin had her jailed, where she was beaten and humiliated before forcing her back to her husband. But Pulan refused to give up easily. She escaped again. By then, her reputation had been destroyed to the point of no repair. You see, in the rigid social structure of her village, she was now an outcast, alone, shamed, and with no place to call home. And so, at 16, now a runaway, Pulan's life would take an even darker turn. She became involved with a gang of bandits. Whether she joined voluntarily or was abducted remains unclear, but it was here that she met Vikram Malla, a man who would change her life forever. Now, their story began with violence. Vikram killed the gang's leader, Babu Gujar, after he attempted to assault Pulan. Vikram then assumed control of the gang, and Pulan became both his partner in crime and in life, and together they would roam villages, targeting wealthy and powerful families. Their raids redistributed wealth amongst the poor, earning him a reputation like a Robin Hood duo amongst the marginalized. But to the others, and in the eyes of the media, they were dangerous criminals. Pulan in particular captured public fascination. Her daring exploits and bold defiance of societal norms earned her the title, the Bandit Queen. But life among bandits was far from harmonious. The gang fractured into factions, with tensions flaring between Vikram's allies and a group led by Shri Ram and Lala Ram, 2 brothers from a more powerful social group. This rivalry boiled into heated violence, and in the ensuing conflict, Vikram was killed, and Pulan was taken captive by the brothers for 3 weeks. She endured unspeakable abuse at their hands, but again, Pulan refused to be broken. With the help of loyal allies, she managed to escape and rebuild her life, this time as the leader of her own gang. But this time for Pulan, it wasn't just about survival, it was about revenge. So, on Valentine's Day in 81, Pulan and her gang headed to Bemai, a single goal in their minds, seeking revenge on everyone who had tormented Pulan. But when they couldn't find any of them, Pulan refused to just leave empty-handed. She and her gang went from house to house, looting valuables, and then they lined up 22 at the Yamuna River and shot them from behind, execution style. News about that massacre made headlines everywhere in the country, and Pulan became one of India's most wanted. For 2 years, Pulan and the gang were able to evade capture. Finally, in 1983, Pulan grew tired of living on the run and surrendered to the authorities on her own terms. She ensured that her gang members were going to be treated fairly by the system and that no death penalty was going to be given to anyone from her gang. Pulan herself faced over 50 charges, including murder and banditry. She ultimately served 11 years in prison, despite an agreement that she would spend only 8 years behind bars. In 1994, the government finally relented and dropped all charges against Pulan Devi, marking the beginning of the next chapter in her life, one that nobody saw coming. You see, after her release from prison, Pulan went into politics politics, aligning herself with the Samajwadi Party, which advocated the rights of marginalized communities like her own. She once said, "I want to bring hospitals, schools, electricity, and clean water to the poor in the villages, to stop child marriage, and to improve life for women." 1996. Pulan was elected to parliament. Her speeches were always bold and unapologetic, addressing issues her peers often avoided. And despite her past, she was loved by the people of India, who thought she was the voice of the unheard. She was re-elected back again in 1999. Throughout the years she spent as a politician, she was always a force to be reckoned with. But her past never truly let her go. You see, on July 25th, 2001, as Pulan stepped outside her home in Delhi, 3 masked gunmen ambushed her, opening fire and killing her on the spot. The attack was planned by Sher Singh Rana, who claimed he was avenging the Bamai massacre. Rana was later captured and in 2014 sentenced to life in prison. Pulan isn't the only gangster on this list who ventured into politics only for their notorious reputation to eventually catch up with them. It's February 18th, 2011, at the Los Cuernos Hotel in Ciudad Pedro de Alvarado in Guatemala, and it was bustling with activities. Here we have Mayra Lemus, a mayoral candidate, and she's having lunch with her campaign team. The local elections were just months away, and Mayra was rallying support for her to run. But outside, her enemies were closing in. Without warning, 2 pickup trucks pull up to the hotel. Masked men armed with assault rifles storm inside. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the air, screams filling up the room, and in moments, the lively atmosphere turned into a scene of horror. 8 people would be killed in this ambush, including Mayra. And just a few blocks away, her younger sister, Maritza, heard the gunfire. She jumped into her armored truck and raced toward the hotel. And by the time she arrived, it was too late. Inside, she would find her sister's lifeless body in the back of a room where Mayra had tried to hide. The attackers had fired through the door, killing her instantly. The massacre at Los Cuernos was horrifying, but for those who knew Mayra, it wasn't entirely unexpected. You see, Mayra Lemus wasn't just a politician. She was one of Guatemala's most feared drug traffickers. A local once said, "She was famous for being a killer. The whole town was scared of her because she was a killer. It's that simple. She decided who lived and who died." Mayra ran the empire with absolute control, and stories of her brutality were everywhere. Some people even claim she killed her own husband and dumped his body in some remote area, though his remains were never found, and no charges were ever brought against her. And well, with the local police firmly in her pocket, Mayra acted without fear of consequences, spreading her influence and silencing anyone brave or foolish enough to challenge her. But her death wasn't just about revenge. It was part of a much larger power struggle. In the months leading up to her murder, the mayoral race had become a battleground, not just for political power, but for control of the region's lucrative drug trade. Mayra's main rival, Roberto Marroquin Fuentes, was another powerful criminal figure. Now, many believed he was behind the attack, though he denied any involvement, claiming he wasn't even near the hotel when it happened. Maritza, however, was certain Marroquin had murdered her sister. Now determined to avenge Mayra, she had stepped into her sister's shoes, taking over both the drug empire and the mayoral campaign. To strengthen her position, she teams up with Ronnie Rodriguez, another rival of Marroquin's. Rodriguez had a real shot at winning, until he too was assassinated just months after Mayra's death. And with Rodriguez out of the picture, Marroquin easily won the election in a landslide. So now Maritza's furious and grieving, and she turns her attention to revenge. And over the next few years, she allegedly orchestrates 3 assassination attempts against Marroquin. The first comes in November 2013, when gunmen attacked his car. A month later, bombs were planted on a bridge he was supposed to cross, though they failed to detonate. The third attempt occurred in November 2014, while Maritza was already behind bars. In a violent ambush, armed assailants injured Marroquin, his wife, and his bodyguard. And even with Maritza locked up, Marroquin Queen was certain she was behind it. As for Maritza, she wasn't willing to remain behind bars. In 2016, she makes her first escape, climbing over the wall with help from other inmates. She was captured within hours, but that didn't stop her. A year later, she escaped again, this time from the high-security Mariscal Zavala military prison. Dressed in a guard's uniform, she slips past security and into a waiting car. Now, when she was recaptured 2 weeks later in El Salvador, she had dyed her hair a deep red, just like her sister Myra's, and because of her daring escapes, she got the nickname El Chapo of Guatemala. Each time Maritza broke free, Marroquin lived in fear. Sources close to him said he avoided leaving his house while she was at large, terrified she'd come for him. Maritza, it seems, enjoyed this fear. She reportedly said, "I know Marroquin is terrified of me because I'm a woman who took the reins, and I'm gonna avenge myself and all of the family that he took away from me." Today, Maritza Lemus is serving a 97-year sentence for murder and kidnapping. The death of her sister set her on this path of blood and vengeance, but it also sealed her fate. And whether she'll manage to escape prison a third time and finally get her revenge, well, only time will tell. It's August 20th, 2011, in the basement of her family's home in Calabria, southern Italy. Maria Concetta Cacciola made a fateful choice, or perhaps had it forced upon her. She swallows a highly corrosive acid, a substance so potent that it burned her body from the inside out. Hours later, she was dead. But was it truly suicide, as her family claimed, or was it something far more sinister, maybe a punishment for daring to defy the iron grip of the 'Ndrangheta? Since day one, Maria's life had been shaped by the 'Ndrangheta, one of Italy's most powerful and feared mafia organizations. Now for them, family is more than a bond. It was the very core base of their criminal empire. This is what they called omerta, an extreme form of loyalty and solidarity, and anyone who broke the rules faced punishment worse than death. And so under such rules, Maria stood no chance. Long before she had a chance to dream, her entire life was already planned for her. You see, when she was 13, Maria was forced to marry someone she didn't choose, and she had her first kid at 15, and then 2 more after that. According to her family, Maria's role stopped at bearing children and keeping the family's legacy. But Maria wanted more. She wanted to be more. Now desperate to escape the tight clutches of the 'Ndrangheta, Maria made a dangerous decision, one that was punishable by death in her family's dictionary. You see, Maria knew all of her family's secrets, their drug trafficking operations, extortion, and money laundering, and decided to approach the Carabinieri, Italy's military police, offering to cooperate with them in exchange for protection. And so Maria would be placed in witness protection, and for the first time in her life, she felt free. In a letter to her mother, she wrote, "I was married at 13. It ruined our lives. It's everything that I didn't want. I wanted peace, love, to feel, to be myself." For a while there, Maria had her whole life ahead of her. She was free to make her own choices and decide what she wanted to do with her life. But that freedom came at a cost. When Maria had approached the police, she knew it'd be dangerous and had to leave her kids behind. And sadly, her family knew exactly how to exploit her love for them. They told her, "If you don't come back, you'll never see your children again." The threat worked. Against the advice of her protectors, Maria returned to Calabria, hoping to reunite with her children. But instead of a reunion, she walked right into a trap. Her father and brother take her straight to a lawyer's office, where she was made to record a statement retracting everything she had told the authorities. Under duress, Maria claims that she had lied about her family, saying that she had only acted out of anger. And back in her family home, Maria's life would become a nightmare. She was beaten, isolated, and treated like a prisoner. In one call to the police, she said, "I'm scared. Maybe not directly of my family, of my father, like not right now, but there's the whole context. Things are getting out that I've been with the law." Maria planned another escape. Police contacts set a date to extract her from that house. But on the day of her escape, Maria called to delay the plan, saying her daughter had a fever. Hours later, Maria's dead. The details of Maria's death quickly raised suspicion. Her family insisted that she had taken her own life, but investigators found evidence suggesting otherwise. Scratches on her wrist indicating that she had been restrained, and her injuries were consistent with being forced to drink the acid. As a result, Maria's parents and brother were arrested, charged with family harassment leading to suicide, a crime that carries maximum sentences of 20 years in Italy. But even with these arrests, the full truth of what happened to Maria remains shrouded in mystery. Maria's 3 children grow up without a mother. Every Sunday, they still visit the grave to lay flowers. One of them dreams of becoming a psychologist, perhaps driven by a desire to make sense of the pain and betrayal that defined Maria's life. Maria's story is heartbreaking, to say the least, but sadly, it isn't unique. Dranguetan women often face unimaginable cruelty when they try to break free. Maria's courage in speaking out was extraordinary, but it also made her a target. And sadly, hers isn't the first story that proves just how far the Drangheta is willing to go to maintain control, and likely it won't be the last. November 24th, 2009. Another tragedy tied to the 'Ndrangheta takes place in Milan, Italy. Leah Garofalo was lured into the city under the guise of a peaceful meeting with her estranged husband. But what she didn't see coming was that her husband and his accomplices had planned her murder. Leah was strangled to death with a curtain rod. That's not even the peak of the brutality that occurred that night. Her murderers would take her body to a warehouse and burn it over the course of 3 days. But why'd they kill her, you ask? Well, Leah's only crime was daring to break free from the 'Ndrangheta's control. April 24th, 1974. Leah was born in a small village in Calabria. Her family belonged to a powerful faction of the 'Ndrangheta, and since day one, Leah's life was shaped by the violent and brutal reality of being part of one of the most formidable mafia organizations in the world. Now, her father was murdered right after she was born, and her village was always plagued by multiple killings as she grew up. And like other women in the 'Ndrangheta, Leah's life was completely controlled by the men in her family. Leah married Carlo Casco, a man she believed would help her escape the mafia's grip. Carlo wasn't the savior she hoped for. He was a small-time cocaine smuggler who saw his marriage to Leah, a member of the mafia aristocracy, as a step up in his own criminal career. And as their marriage drew Leah deeper into the world she despised, she grew increasingly depressed. But after the birth of her daughter Denise in 1991, Leah found a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't want her daughter to endure the same life she had. In 2002, Leah made the brave decision to collaborate with Italian authorities and testify against the 'Ndrangheta, revealing critical information about its operations. But breaking the mafia's code of silence, omerta, came with immense risk, and therefore Leah and Denise were placed in witness protection, moving frequently and living in fear. Leah slept with a knife under her pillow and would also take self-defense classes. Yet life in hiding was isolating. Unable to work or build a stable life, she began to lose faith in the state's ability to protect her. In 2009, feeling all abandoned and desperate for a better future for Denise, she made the fateful decision to leave witness protection and decided to contact Carlo, hoping to reconcile with him. At first, Carlo pretended to welcome back Leah. He invited her and Denise to a family trip in Milan, and for 4 days they were actually the epitome of a happy family. But all the while, Carlo was secretly plotting Leah's murder with his accomplices from the 'Ndrangheta, and on the night of the 24th, they finally orchestrated that gruesome plan. Carlo's men succeeded. Leah was strangled with a curtain rod, her body driven to a warehouse and burned over the course of 3 days. Carlo tried convincing Denise that her mother had left him and ran off to Australia, but Denise didn't buy that, and she knew for sure that Carlo himself was a part of her mother's disappearance. She decides to step into her mom's shoes and cooperate with the authorities to bring her mother's killers to justice. And so for years, Denise stays under the same roof with the man she believed had killed her mother, secretly gathering information about the family's criminal activities and passing it off to the police. Her bravery ultimately brought her father and his crew down. By 2012, Carlo Casco and 5 other men from that criminal network were convicted of Leah's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Denise's testimony was the last screw in their coffin. Now, the murder of women linked to the mafia in Italy rarely receives any public sympathy, but as details of Leah's courageous fight against the 'Ndrangheta finally came to light, public opinion shifted. Leah became a symbol of resistance against organized crime, inspiring a movement. 2013, a public funeral's held for Leah. Thousands gathered to honor her, and Denise addresses the crowd, saying, "Mama, thank you for all you did for me. Thank you for giving me a better life. Everything that happened, everything you did, I know you did it all for me, and I'll never stop thanking you." September 23, 2024, the Baia nightclub in Molfetta, Italy, was alive with music and laughter. Among the revelers was 19-year-old Antonia Lopez, or Antonella, as her friends called her. It was meant to be a carefree night out, but it ended in tragedy. For by the end of that evening, Antonella lay lifeless on the floor. Her death wasn't random. It was a tragic result of a brewing mafia conflict, where a nightclub had become the battleground for rival clans. Antonia Lopez was no stranger to the shadows of organized crime. Her family was deeply tied to the Strasuglio clan in Bari, but despite this, Antonia herself had no criminal record, and it's not even clear whether she was secretly involved in her family's business. Regardless, she certainly didn't deserve the fate that awaited her at that nightclub. But before we get there, don't you want to know what caused the chaos that took place that night? The Strasuglio clan, which Antonia's family belonged to, was involved in a violent feud, Parisi Palermiti clan. Now, this long simmering rivalry had stemmed from disputes over drugs, extortions, and profitable territories. And in that Bahia nightclub, the tension finally snapped. That night, 21-year-old Michelle Lavopa, nicknamed Tupac, walked into the club with a loaded .765 caliber pistol. Now, his target that night was definitely not Antonia, for she was a member of his own clan, but she was also a close friend of Eugenio Palermiti, the 20-year-old heir of Parisi Palermiti clan. Now, days earlier, Eugenio's men had kidnapped Tupac and brutally beat him. Not only that, but they would film the whole thing and share it on social media. Lavopa was the first to arrive at the club that night. He would wait patiently until Eugenio and his group entered the club, and then all hell breaks loose. He fires off 7 shots into the crowd. One of those bullets strikes Antonia in the shoulder, severing her aorta. She collapses to the floor and bleeds out before anybody has a chance to try to help her. 4 others, including Eugenio, were injured, but none of their wounds were fatal. Eugenio received the news of Antonio's death at the hospital. He lashed out at the staff, destroying equipment and promising to get revenge. But nothing would bring Antonia back. If anything, it would certainly cause more bloodshed. Meanwhile, Lavopa had fled the scene in the chaos that followed, but he was arrested the following day. He ended up confessing to police, admitting that he only brought the gun with him to protect himself, a practice he claimed was common in Bari's nightclubs. He also said he never meant to shoot anyone, panicking only when he thought Eugenio was reaching for his weapon, supposedly to kill him. However, investigators found no proof of this. In the end, though, Antonia's death ended up bringing both grief and fear to the Molfetta community. They all know that nightclubs and public areas are now scenes of violent power plays by young people connected to the Mafia, transforming what were supposedly safe and fun places into these dangerous war zones. Francesco Gianella, head of Bari's anti-mafia directorate, addressed the situation, saying, "These places are no longer just for fun. They've become arenas for violence, where young criminals showcase their power." Authorities now fear that Antonia's death may ignite further violence between the two clans, causing even more mayhem in the streets of Italy. January 11th, 2020. What was supposed to be Carem Lisbeth Yepes Ortiz's happiest day of her life soon turned into her worst nightmare. Carem walks down the aisle, smiling at her soon-to-be husband, a notorious drug lord known as El Calamardo. But as the bride and groom were about to say their vows, a group of armed men suddenly storm into the church and start firing into the crowd. When the dust settled, Carem was laying on the floor, lifeless. She'd been shot by the attackers, and her groom had been kidnapped. Now, who were these armed men, and why did they target Carem? Well, this wasn't a random act of violence. It was just the latest attack in a bloody turf war between the powerful CJNG, or Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and the Santa Rosa de Lima gang, led by Carem's brother, Jose Antonio Yepes Ortiz, better yet known as El Mato. And to get the full picture of this tragedy, you first have to look at the CJNG's history of violence.
Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, is the single criminal organization most responsible for these deaths on both sides of the border.
2009, the cartel starts off as a branch of the Milenio cartel. In just a few years, it transforms into one of the most dangerous, fastest growing, and richest cartels in Mexico. The leader of this is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, also known as El Mencho, who once worked as a policeman in Jalisco. Under Mencho's reign, the CJNG has become notorious for gruesome tactics like mass killings, acid bathing, and even cannibalism tribalism as a training method for new recruits. Their message was always clear: mess with us, and the consequences will be horrific. And so, over the years, they've committed countless atrocities. An example of such is the horrific event taking place at the busy evening rush hour in Veracruz, where 35 bodies, bound and subjected to torture, were dumped in the streets for everyone to witness. Another time, they would kill a man and his son by attaching dynamite sticks to their bodies and detonating them. They recorded that on their phones while laughing and mocking the victims. So you kind of get the picture here, right? Would you think messing with these people is ever a good idea? Well, we personally don't think so, but someone else believed he could challenge him. And as we said, Carem's brother, El Mato, ran the Santa Rosa de Lima gang, which made its fortune by stealing fuel from pipelines in Guanajuato. And with the CJ&G already operating in the region, conflict was inevitable. But it reached a peak when a narcomanta, or a banner, often used by cartels to send messages, appeared in Guanajuato, threatening Mexico's president to pull security forces out of the region. This banner was signed by El Mato's gang. Now here's the thing. Once El Mato realized that it was probably not a good idea to threaten the country's president, he denied all responsibility for it, claiming it was set up by his rival, El Mencho. Well, El Mencho, however, saw that as a challenge to his authority, and he grew even more determined to crush Mato's gang once and for all. So the CJ&G would begin launching a series of violent attacks against the Santa Rosa de Lima, including the wedding massacre. Now, Carem wasn't just some innocent bystander in all this. She was deeply involved in Santa Rosa's operations and even reportedly co-led the gang with her brother. However, it's unclear if she was one of the CJ&G's targets that day or just unlucky to be caught in the crossfire. What is clear, though, was that El Maro was the CJ&G's #1 target that day. But despite that, he fled the church during the chaos and went into hiding. It wouldn't last long, though. On August 2nd, 2020, he was captured in a joint operation by Mexican security forces. This arrest was hailed as a major victory against organized crime, and many believed it marked the end of the Santa Rosa de Lima gang. They were wrong. January 2024, a photo goes viral in Mexico, showing a woman rumored to be the new leader of Santa Rosa de Lima. She was accused of orchestrating massacres, attacks on police, and other acts of violence in Guanajuato. The shocking part, many believe this woman is none other than Carem Lisbeth Yepes Ortiz. How could this be? Now, some speculate that Carem faked her death to escape the CJ&G's wrath and has been quietly rebuilding the brothers' empire ever since. After all, authorities never officially confirmed her death at the wedding. Others remain skeptical, though, but one thing is clear. Whoever this woman is, she's continuing the deadly feud against the CJ&G. But the CJ&G isn't that type of organization that forgives or forgets. If Carem or someone else in her name is leading this fight against them, the road ahead is going to be very dangerous and really bloody. January 5th, 2015. A picture starts circulating on social media. In it, a young woman smiles sweetly, wearing a bulletproof vest, holding a gun. She looks pretty innocent, but that attire reveals something darker. She's a hitwoman for the Gulf Cartel. Her name was Jocelyn Alejandra Niño, known as La Flaca, or the Skinny One. And within hours of that photo going viral, it exposed Jocelyn's identity, not only to the public, but also to her enemies. And then what had started as a subtle warning quickly spiraled into a death sentence. Now, Jocelyn got that nickname not for her slender physique, but as a nod to Our Lady of Holy Death, a skeletal figure. It wasn't uncommon for women like her to be recruited into organized crime. Cartels would exploit these women for their looks and charms and manipulate situations. But some of these women would defy the odds and rise through the ranks, becoming foot soldiers on the ground, responsible for enforcing the cartel's will through violence, just like their male counterparts. Now, Jocelyn was a member of Los Ciclones, a faction of the Gulf Cartel. Her group was involved in this violent turf war with Los Metros, which also happened to be a rival faction of the Gulf Cartel. Both factions are fighting for control for territories in Rio Bravo, Tamaulipas. And when Jocelyn's photo was leaked, it was far from being a mere accident. Los Metros were the ones responsible for that leak. They wanted to humiliate Los Ciclones by exposing their members on social media. And it was a strategy designed to make them well known to rival cartels cartels and law enforcement. And for Jocelyn, the consequences were both quick and brutal. When that photo was leaked, she knew her life was in danger, but had no choice but to continue her duties as an enforcer, helping her faction defend the ground against Los Metros. Now that danger eventually caught up with her on April 12, 2015, when Los Metros captured Jocelyn and 2 other members of Los Ciclones. The very next day, authorities discovered a horrific scene in a supermarket parking lot. Inside an ice cooler were Jocelyn's mutilated remains, stuffed alongside the dismembered bodies of a man and another woman. It was clear that the victims had been tortured for days before their deaths, likely to extract information. They only knew it was Jocelyn because of a tattoo on her forearm that read Niño, her last name. The Los Metros aimed to do more than just defeat their enemies. They wanted to make an example out of them. Images of her mutilated body began circulating Twitter, shared by Los Metros. One picture showed her lying injured on the ground next to other victims, shortly before they were dismembered. A second picture revealed her body stuffed in a cooler. Next to it was a terrifying message. "This is the fate of all the scum who back Los Ciclones." The note didn't stop at taunting Los Ciclones, though. It would mock them for employing female soldiers, and warned them that more carnage would follow if they dared encroach on Los Metros' territory. Jocelyn's death was brutal, but in the world she inhabited, it sadly wasn't unique. The name La Flaca seemed almost cursed. She wasn't the first female assassin to carry that nickname, nor the first to meet a gruesome end. In the world of cartels, women often find themselves trapped in a brutal system where their worth is measured by how useful they can be. Their loyalty goes as far as to serve someone else's agenda, and their lives are treated as disposable. Jocelyn's story is just one of many, a haunting reflection of the violent and chaotic reality that defines life in Mexico's underworld. September 3rd, 2012. The streets of Medellin were bustling as Griselda Blanco stepped out of a butcher shop, unaware of the motorbike creeping toward her. In seconds, 2 shots rang out. The infamous queen of cocaine falls to the ground, lifeless, her reign ending as violently as it began.
We were all surprised that a female godmother was responsible for this much violence, could be this evil.
Griselda Blanco was one of the most ruthless figures in the history of organized crime. Known as La Madrina or the Godmother, she built a cocaine empire in the 70s and 80s that rivaled the power of the infamous Medellin cartel. And while men like Pablo Escobar are often remembered as the faces of the drug trade, it was Blanco setting the stage, dominating the trade and carving her legacy into blood and fear. In 1943, Griselda Blanco was born into the impoverished slums of Cartagena, Colombia. Even as a child, Blanco reportedly exhibited disturbing behavior. When she was just 11, it was said that she kidnapped a boy for ransom and brutally killed him when his family failed to pay. Now, she was this way because she grew up in an abusive household, one she desperately wanted to escape. Now, she did eventually run away, but found herself on the harsh streets of Medellin, where she was forced to turn to theft and prostitution as a means of survival. But her real introduction to the crime underworld came when she crossed paths with her first husband, Carlos Trujillo, a small-time smuggler. Now, she kept delving deeper into that dangerous world, eventually meeting Alberto Bravo, her second husband, who introduced her to the cocaine trade. Together, they would move to Queens, New York in the 1970s, where they built that drug empire, smuggling massive amounts of cocaine from Colombia to the U.S. Blanco's clever smuggling methods, usually hiding cocaine in women's underwear, enabled their operation to grow even bigger than the city's Italian Mafia. However, Blanco had bigger dreams, and she wanted to play solo. She allegedly had Trujillo murdered, and later confronted Bravo over missing millions. That argument escalated into a gunfight, during which Blanco shot and killed him, solidifying her reputation as fearless and lethal, and, well, a black widow. After fleeing legal troubles in New York, Blanco relocated to Miami, where she earned the nickname Queen of Cocaine. At the time, the city was becoming the epicenter of the U.S. drug trade, and Blanco was at its heart, smuggling over 3,000 pounds of cocaine a month and amassing a billion-dollar fortune. Her lavish lifestyle included mansions, private jets, wild parties, but her reign also brought chaos and bloodshed into her world. Blanco's methods were as innovative as they were violent. She was one of the first to use motorbikes for drive-by shootings, a tactic she pioneered in Medellin and brought to the U.S. Her sicarios left trails of bodies across Miami, targeting rivals, informants, and sometimes innocent bystanders. By 1979, one of her most infamous hits would occur where her gunman, driving an armored war wagon, killed a drug dealer in a crowded shopping mall, sparking what would later become known as the Cocaine Cowboys era, period of rampant drug-related violence in Miami between the U.S. government and the cartels. But as Blanco's power grew, so did her list of enemies. She was feared even within her own organization. Her most loyal hitman, Jorge Ayala, once revealed that when Blanco ordered a hit, she didn't care who else got caught in the crossfire. Women, children, and entire families were often collateral damage. But by the end of the early 1980s, Blanco's empire began to crumble under law enforcement pressure. The DEA eventually captured her in 1985 and gave her 20 years in prison. However, that legend would only grow during incarceration. Even behind bars, she managed to maintain control over parts of her cartel. In 1994, things changed when her trusted hitman, Ayala, turned against her, providing evidence that could have led to her execution.
After over 10 years of intense investigation, Miami and Metro Police say they have enough evidence to pin the 1982 murders of 3 Dade County people on this woman, 51-year-old Grisela Blanco.
However, a scandal involving Ayala and a secretary from the district attorney's office undermined his credibility, allowing Blanco to take a plea deal. She served just 6 more years before being deported to Colombia. Now back in Medellin, Blanco tried to live a relatively quiet life, reportedly focused on raising her grandchildren, but her violent past did catch up with her. By the time of her death in 2012, she had messed with so many people and made so many enemies that actually pinpointing her killer was impossible. Now, some suspected a rival cartel. Others say it was a relative of one of her countless victims. What is certain is that her death was draped in irony. Blanco was killed in a motorcycle drive-by shooting, the very same method she'd pioneered decades earlier.